Most people, even Christians, decide what they're going to do by what they see first. And if you decide whether you're going to do what God says do on the front end because you see it, then you're not exercising faith and you have canceled out seeing God move. So we regularly cancel out the supernatural because we got to see the natural first. Many of us are controlled by our circumstances and the devil because we're waiting to see first before we obey first, nullifying the movement of God. Faith must precede sight if it's going to be biblical faith. Now, having explained this, he now comes to his culminating section, his culminating point in the book. He said, if I had some time, if I had the time, I'd tell you about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets. But I don't have time. I don't have time. I don't have space to go into all these other folk I haven't gone into. So since he didn't have a time, I'm going to take a minute to tell you about these folk he didn't have time to go into detail on like he did all the previous people in the first 31 verses of chapter 11. He starts off with Gideon in verse 32. Gideon was a judge, but Gideon was not scared, he was stirred. He was a passive guy, and then God called on him because Israel was being invaded by the enemy. And he said, Gideon, I want you to go out there and I want you to take care of the enemy of my people. So Gideon, as scared as he was, went out and amassed an army of 32,000 men. To which God said, you may need them, I don't. Your army's too big. So I want you to shrink it down again until you get down to 300. God, you got to be kidding me. You want me to fight an army that's huge with 300 men. No, Gideon, I want you to fight an army with 300 men and me. So guess what he did? He dropped logic, what he could see, comparing his 32,000 with a group that he was going to fight. He dropped his logic and he obeyed God. When he obeyed God, he routed the army with 300 men because God joined the 300 when he obeyed what he couldn't see. If you ask him to logically figure it out, he couldn't do it. He had to do what God said do, even when what God said do made absolutely no sense at all. So since the author of Hebrews didn't have time to tell you, I just thought I'd tell you that by faith, Gideon routed an army, even though he was scared to do it. The next name you get is Barak. If Gideon was scared, Barak was weak. He was a weak man. He was a man who ran from difficulty and ran from trouble. In fact, he got his strength from a woman named Deborah. And with the encouragement of Deborah, who had heard the word from the Lord and transferred it to Barak, he believed that word, even though he was a weak man, and God used him by faith to rout the enemies of Israel. Gideon was scared, Barak was weak, and Samson was a player. Samson was a man who had moral dilemmas. When he was willing to operate by faith, God would supernaturally invade him and use him to take care of the Philistines, so that the Bible says he killed 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey. And at his ending days, he killed more in his death than he had killed in his life, because when God got his attention, he would see the supernatural enter into the natural. The man had some problems. The man had some issues, but he still shows up in Hebrews 11. It didn't nullify the consequences, but what it did say was when you're ready to operate by faith, you can see God show up. Japheth. Let me tell you about Japheth. I'm only telling you because the author of Hebrews didn't have time. Japheth was the son of a prostitute. He was in a messed up family situation. But when God was looking for somebody to deliver his people, he went over to Japheth and said, Japheth, I know that your background isn't the best. I know that your family situation isn't preferable, but if you will do what I tell you to do, I'm going to use you in spite of your past. I'm not going to let your past control your present or what I'm going to do with you in your future, but you got to do what I tell you to do. Japheth obeyed God and routed the enemies of God in spite of a poor background. Then there's David. David's short. David's small. David's young. David's inexperienced. But he runs into this mammoth man named Goliath of Gath. And in 1 Samuel 17, he takes a slingshot and 5 smooth stones and brings the giant down to his level and below. How did he do that? Because David said, well, everybody else was looking up here at how tall Goliath was. I was looking down there and noticed he hadn't been circumcised. Says that man is an uncircumcised Philistine. He hadn't been to the doctor. Because he's uncircumcised, there is no divine covering, so I got him. I may be smaller, I may be shorter, and I may be younger, but in the name of God, we're going to turn this thing around. So he didn't let his size determine where this battle was going to wind up. So just because the author of Hebrews 11 didn't have time, I thought I'd tell you about it. Didn't have Samuel. He says Samuel had a problem. Samuel was weak as a father. We find out Samuel was weak as a father, and when he was weak as a father, we're told in 1 Samuel chapter 8 that his sons no longer followed the Lord. And so Samuel had some flaws as a dad. He didn't even win his own sons, but when he was willing to operate by faith, the prophet Daniel would be anointing the king of Israel, setting the nation of Israel on a spiritual course that would lead them to a new direction. Now, why does he go through those names, and why did I go through those names? Because each one of those folks by faith achieved greatness, wound up in the hall of faith, are one of our heroes in Hebrews chapter 11, even though they had flaws in their lives. Every one of them had weak spots. Every one of them had areas that they hadn't developed yet. Every one of them had places that needed to be shored up and strengthened. But when they were willing to operate by faith, God graduated them to our museum, the Hall of Faith, and made them one of the heroes. I don't know about your yesterday. I do know if you'll live by faith today, God can still use you tomorrow and recognize you for what you have done and achieved by faith. But it must be by faith, and faith must precede sight. If you're waiting for sight, it's no longer faith. When you face it by faith, God joins you in it. When you face it by sight, you take care of it. He comes at the end of verse 22 and says, and then the prophets, there's so many of them, I ain't even gonna name them. He said, but let me tell you what faith can do. Verse 33, it conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises. Like Daniel and the lions, then shut the mouths of lions. Like the 3 Hebrew boys, quenched the power of fire. Escaped the edge of the sword. In weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. He says, faith, watch this, is unprecedented in its power. Because it can rout whole nations. It can put out fires. It can make lions keep their mouths shut. He says, you don't understand the power of faith, but you must be operating by biblical faith, which means faith must precede sight. Let me tell you something else about faith. Verse 35, women receive back their dead by resurrection. That's what Elijah and Elisha did. They raised up the dead sons of the widows. They raised them up. Now, Let me tell you how bad, meaning good, faith is. Faith can flip the natural order of things. He says by faith, God flipped the natural order of things so that that which died became alive. Some of you have testimonies of what it looks like when God comes out of nowhere and flips it. And you wonder where it came from. The way the Bible does that is with the word immediately. God just came out of nowhere and turned something. He says, and others. Somebody say others. Verse 35, were tortured, not accepting their release so that they may obtain a better resurrection. And others, verse 36, experienced mockings and scourgings, yes, also chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawed in two, they were tempted, they were put to death with the sword. They went about in sheepskin, goatskin, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated. He says, now, let me tell you about others. This is not the kind of testimony folk want to hear. So let me tell you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God. Anybody who tells you, okay, go live for Christ and you will not suffer has lied to you. They've told you half of the story. They've only told you half. Because he says, and others. They are those who were penalized for their faith. He says something very interesting that it's you might miss. He says, not accepting their release. That's interesting. He talks about all this negative stuff, and then he throws in there, not accepting their release. Well, now, if you tell me I don't accept my release, that means one was offered to me. Okay? If I didn't accept something, that means I rejected it. So they could have gotten out of their torture. They could have gotten out of their mocking and scourging and negative repercussions, but they chose not to get out of it. They chose to say, no, I'd rather die. I'd rather be sawed in half. I'd rather be mocked. I'd rather be scorned. Thank you for offering me release, but I turn it down. Now, why would they do that? Nobody wants to go look for persecution. Only a fool goes and looks for pain. Only a fool turns down the opportunity not to be in pain. But he says they turned it down. Two things you need to know. They turned it down, one, because of the reason they're going through it. They're going through it because of their association with the Lord. Their association with the Lord has put them in this mocking predicament. We're not talking about people who are stealing and cheating and robbing and evil and killing. No. They didn't accept their release. In other words, the folks causing them trouble was saying, if you deny the Lord, if you deny your faith, if you compromise your character, if you do that, then we will let you keep your job. Then we will let you stay. Then we'll give you a raise. Then we'll do that. You just gotta not be Christian. You gotta go along with the crowd. You gotta be secular. And they say, I ain't doing that. No, we'll make it okay as long as you are no longer a follower of the Lord. No longer a Christian. Go to church, be religious, but don't be a follower of Christ and bring those Christian values in here. As long as you do that, everything's going to be okay. They said no. Not accepting the release. Not accepting the compromise. There's a second reason they said no. They said no, watch this now, because they saw a better resurrection. Okay, that's what it says. Not accepting their release because of a better resurrection. What will give you the ability to keep your stand as a Christian and keep living by faith is if you see something better. See, one of the reasons we compromise our faith is we don't think there's something better. So we'll renege on God, we'll renege on his principles. We're all tempted to do it. We've all probably done it on some level or another in our lives, and we'll do it because we're scared there's nothing better. But when you understand that God is a God of resurrection, then you understand that that situation does not have final say-so in your life, because God knows how to give you something better. They saw something better so radically that even the ones who were threatened with death did not renege on staying alive, because heaven was so real they were willing to give up earth, because they looked up like Stephen in Acts chapter 7, saw Jesus standing on the right hand of the Father and said, I see something better. So go ahead and take me up out of here, because God has let me see. See, the reason you're going to be able to, or we all ought to be able to die with dignity is because at the point of death, he gives you dying grace. And dying grace means he lets you see heaven is for real while you're on this side, so you don't mind crossing over to that side, because he lets you see something better. That's why Paul said, whether to stay here or go, I don't know what to do. He said, because to stay here is going to help you, but to leave here is going to help me. And I don't know which is better. Because he lets you see something better. See, what the enemy wants to do is not let you live by faith so you don't get to see anything better. And as long as you don't see anything better, you stay stuck where you are, and you stay stuck on what your 2020 shows you. And if your 2020 doesn't show it to you anymore, you're not going to risk it, because you don't see anything better, because you haven't learned to live by faith. But once you learn to live by faith, God lets you see that he can resurrect situations that you think are going to kill you if you make the right decision in it. He says, and others are willing to risk being fired, willing to risk losing that relationship, willing to risk, because they are going to operate by faith in their families, as women, as wives. Many of you will never see financial victory in your family because you've chosen money over spiritual priority in the home. We rob God of giving. We say to God, well, now if you give to me, I'll give back to you. That's not faith. That's sight, because he's already given it to you first. He says, no, you honor me first, then you will see what I will do with your barns. You won't see it without faith. So you can pick any category. It operates in faith. Then he concludes here. 38. Men of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. Okay. Let me say about folk for whom the world is not worthy. There are a few people in the congregation right now who this world is not worthy of. What makes the world not worthy of certain people? Because they live so high in the spiritual realm, even though they're living physically in the earthly realm, that the physical realm doesn't even know what they're talking about. The physical realm thinks they're weird. The physical realm thinks they're crazy. The physical world thinks they've lost their mind. The physical world thinks that they've become fanatic. The physical world thinks that they're psychotic. He said the world isn't worthy of those kind of folk who live this way. And the reason why many of us don't live this way is we don't know anybody who does. We don't hang out with anybody who does. We only live with folk who live by sight. And so we never get to grow to faith because we hang out with folk who the world is worthy of, not who the world is not worthy of, because they don't live in this world. They live in that world while walking in this world. And what you want in your circle of influence are some folk who live up there even though they walk down here. They operate from heaven's point of view, consistently, faith is how they roll. It's not a place they visit. And so he concludes, he says, and all these having gained approval through their faith, watch this, did not receive what was promised because God had provided something better for us so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. Okay, Nate, you may not get that when you first look at it. So let me explain it, Lucy. He says, and all these Old Testament saints he talked about, gained approval by God, by faith, watch this, having not all received the promises. So some or many of the Old Testament saints didn't get what they were looking for. Abraham never got to own the land God promised. He got to wonder on it, he never got to own it, although it was a promise. So they got to see God work, but they didn't get to see everything God said. He says the reason that some of the Old Testament saints didn't get to see everything God said was that God was waiting on us. Who's the us? The us are the New Testament Christians. That's you and me. There's before Christ, Old Testament. Then there's after Christ, New Testament. He said in the Old Testament, they got a bunch of stuff. We see miracles in Hebrews 11, but they didn't get it all because they had to wait on us. In other words, they have some stuff we don't have. You and I, many of us would love if we could go back to the Old Testament and see Lazarus raised from the dead, see crossing the Red Sea, see them crossing the Jordan River, see Elijah raising up the dead woman's son. We would love to see and say, I want that miracle. But a lot of them would love to be with us because you and I get a freedom they didn't have living under the law. You and I get some privileges they didn't have in the Old Testament. So he says, the reason God held out on them is so that they could catch up with us. So the idea is they're supposed to learn from us, we're supposed to learn from them so that we get the whole package of what God's promises are for his purposes in our lives. So you and I are supposed to learn from Hebrews 11 in order that we might learn faith so that we can experience based on their example much of what they experienced until God brings us all together around his throne and me and Abraham have a conversation. You go hook up with Rahab and y'all be talking and somebody gonna be talking to Sarah and then somebody gonna be talking to David and David gonna say, yeah, man, let me tell you about that David and Goliath story. Let me give you some details that they didn't have time to go over in 1 Samuel. And you'll be able to talk about what God did in your life by faith. So we'll be able to take the Old Testament Christians and the New Testament Christians and have a conversation about the power of faith on both sides of the cross. I don't know about you, but you ought to be motivated now to live by faith. That's why we don't, see, if I had time, the author of Hebrews told me I don't have no time. But if I had time, I'd at least read to you the first line of Hebrews 12. Therefore. See, whenever you see therefore, you got to ask what it's there for. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses. Come on, you've been in church long enough to know when the preacher says, do I have a witness? See, he said, do I have a witness? Is there anybody here who can testify that God by faith responds? Is there anybody here who can testify that I trusted God when I didn't know the result and I saw what he could do? Is there anybody here who can testify that if you'll trust God in the dark, he'll bring you to the light. Is there anybody here who can testify that the God of the Bible does not lie and he tells the truth? The author of Hebrews says, do I have a witness? In fact, he doesn't want a witness. He wants to know, do I have a cloud of witnesses? That's a whole bunch of folk who can testify that if you trust God, God is able to enter into your situation even when you don't see the result, and he's able to turn that mama out. Do I have a witness? Is there somebody who can testify that faith works in the hands of God's people? The Bible abounds with people who triumph through faith. A whole litany of people who decided to trust God over themselves, over other people, and over their circumstances. The beauty of faith's triumph is that you get divine approval. It doesn't mean everything goes smoothly, but it says of all the others who are people of faith that they triumphed because they got a divine okay. They got a God stamp of approval. And when you get the highest approval possible in creation, then that means you are victorious and you are successful, regardless of how the circumstances are at any given moment. I wish I could tell you that a life of faith means a problemless life, but that's not the world in which we live. That's heaven. On earth, there are going to be ups and downs, but you still can be approved, where God says, you did it. And there's nothing that will make you feel better or be better than the divine approval of God. So let's get divine approval, because we're going to believe him, even when believing him is the last thing we want to believe. Walk by faith, not by sight, so that you can be part of the others who are approved of God.